Charles stepped up. And he's been here several times before, and I'm just so happy he's come here. He's going to share the word with us. And for his scripture, he's asked me to read Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. Brother Charles?
Well, I'm happy to be here this morning with you and to be able to speak to you, even though it was unexpected. I think we need to pray for Pastor Uda and whatever his situation is that has caused him to not be able to come today. And I appreciate your prayers for me as I share today. The title that I chose for this sermon was The Sabbath More Fully. But of course, with the circumstances that led to me speaking to you today, that there was no chance to get that title in the bulletin. So I share it with you now. The Sabbath More Fully. This was something that Ellen White had to say about the Sabbath at some point. I can't give you chapter and verse for her quote, but she said there would come a time when the people of God would share the Sabbath more fully, or preach about the Sabbath more fully. And I like to think that the main part of my story today is an example of preaching the Sabbath more fully. My sermon is built around a story. And I want to remind you that the New Testament says that Jesus didn't speak to the people without a story. It was his habit to use a story as the vehicle for whatever truth he was imparting at the moment. So Jesus recognized the value of a story for conveying messages. And so this is a true story. This is something that happened in my own life. And I enjoy sharing it with you because it was such a special time in my life. And the year that it led to over at Newbold College in England was a very, very special year in my life. So if you'll go with me back in your imaginations to 1974, I realize that some of you are probably not even old enough to do that, but many of you are old enough. Go back with me to 1974. That was the year that I decided I needed the experience of living in a dormitory while taking classes for college. I had been raised in a Seventh-day Adventist home, and from first grade to 10th grade, my parents sent me to a Seventh-day Adventist grade school. It was called Spencerville Junior Academy, and I made some very good friends while I was there at Spencerville. One of them is next to Jim Worson's one of my best friends, and he still lives in Virginia right now, named Rick Spindler. But I made many, many friends back there at Spencerville Junior Academy. I went through all 10 years there. And then when it was time to go to high school, I had a decision to make, because there are Seventh-day Adventist boarding academies on the East Coast that my parents could have sent me to if I had wanted to go to a boarding academy. And half of my friends from Spencerville Junior Academy did that. They went to Blue Mountain Academy or Shenandoah Valley Academy in Virginia, Blue Mountain Academy in Pennsylvania. Some of them went to Highland View Academy in Maryland. But I chose to go to the day school, Tacoma Academy, in Tacoma Park, Maryland, which was only 8 miles from where I lived with my parents. We lived in Wheaton, Maryland, which is one of the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And there was a reason I made that choice. My choice at that time was because I wanted the freedom in quotation marks, that came from being able to drive myself anywhere I wanted to go. In other words, I wanted to drive a car. I wanted to have a license. rather than going to academy where I may or may not have a license, and I certainly wouldn't have much freedom to drive a car anywhere I wanted to go as a boarding student. I chose to go to day academy there at Tacoma Academy. There were about 500 students there in grades 9 through 12. And as I said, it was only 8 miles from where I lived. So I chose that. And most of those days that I commuted to Tacoma Academy, I drove my parents' 1962 Chevrolet back and forth to college for the classes. However, time passed. I graduated from Tacoma Academy. I spent some time working instead of going to college for the first 6 months after high school. I actually said, I think I'll never darken the door of a classroom again. I thought I had it up to here with studying in the classroom. And so I experimented with working on the outside, finding out what it was like to try to make a living and work for a living. I worked for a builder as his carpenter's helper. They had a different way of talking about the carpenter's helper. I won't share that with you, but they had a different name for it. And then after that, I went to work for another general contractor, and he was more into bricklaying than he was into carpentry. So I became a bricklayer's helper later on as I worked my way through college. I had this idea that I didn't want to go into debt in order to have an education. And so I would work the summer times for this general contractor. His name was Dennis Malcolm, a very good man, helped me in many, many different ways. But I learned what it was like to work an 8-hour day at a job, and then come home and do whatever a person does for 5 or 6 hours in the evening, and then go to bed, then get up again at 5 o'clock in the morning in order to get ready to do it all over again. And I found it to be not very charming. So I had second thoughts about college, and I enrolled in Columbia Union College. That I missed the experience of living in a dormitory. I'd never had the experience, but I thought I missed it. I thought it was something that I'd missed out on. And so I decided I would like to have a dormitory experience. And I found out some information that led me to think I could actually spend a year in England attending Newbold College. And I could afford to do it, but I could only afford to do it one way. By this time, I had my own car. I wasn't driving my parents' car. I had bought a 1971 Ford Pinto, and I had made some modifications to it, which made it unique, a little bit different from all the other Pintos out there. I had put special wheels on it and had a stripe painted on the side. And then a friend of mine put a special paint job on the roof of the Pinto, made it look special, even more special. And it was, if I'm to be honest about it, it was one of my idols. I idolized that Pinto. It was a big part of my values at the time, and it gave me the illusion of freedom, being able to drive anywhere I wanted to go, anytime I wanted to go there. And yet I realized that the only way I was going to get to Newbold College was to sell my Pinto. Because the arrangement was, for any American students that came to Newbold College, all the fees for the year had to be paid up front. There was no time payments. They didn't take monthly payments for the tuition and the board and all the other expenses over there. And this was partly because of the way the British government was thinking about things, and it was partly because of the way the school thought about things. But the advantage of going to Newbold College was that I was able to go there without losing any credits toward my degree. their curriculum was based on the Columbia Union College curriculum. So even though we are separated by the big pond, the Atlantic Ocean, I could go there and not lose any time, not lose any credit. And so I wanted to do it, but as I said, I needed to sell my Pinto. So I had already made my initial application to Newbold College and received information back from them, and I had already started the process of enrolling in college for that year, 1974, 1975. And things were moving, but as I said, I still lacked about $1,700. I had saved up $700 or $800 of my own in cash, but I still lacked about $1,700. And now we're talking about 5 days before time to fly to Newbold College. And so I made my ad in the newspaper for the car, put the ad out there and explained a little bit what it was like, and then I named my price $1,700. I got to get $1,700 for this car. And it wasn't very encouraging. A day or two passed, so now I was within 3 days of the time that I would actually get on the airplane to fly to Newbold College, and I didn't have the money. I still had the car, but I didn't have the money. And so I was praying sincerely for God to work this thing out. And then I got a telephone call from a young fellow, 17 years old, and he was from Brazil. His father was a diplomat. Somehow diplomat relationships between Brazil and the United States. His father filled that role, or one of those diplomatic roles. And so he was here in the United States. He was in Washington, D.C. area where I lived, about to go to college, and he wanted my car. But it was like 3 days now until it was time to fly. And he didn't have the money himself. He was just a poor college kid. And so I was wondering, how's this going to work? I was still praying about this. Lord, please help me to work this thing out. And so I'll just give you the short version, because I could make it long. I could make this a long story if I wanted to. The short version was that his father, the diplomat who was in Brazil at the moment, said that he would work it out. And the way he would work it out was he would send pure gold, literal gold, up to Washington, D.C. by courier. He had some friend of his, or some employee of his probably, that would make the trip from Brazil to Washington, D.C. carrying literal gold. Then they would translate it into cash and write me a check for the money. And so I said, okay, what other choice did I have? I didn't have any options, right? It was either this or nothing. And so I agreed to meet this young fellow, this 17-year-old Brazilian boy, on the way to Dulles Airport to get on the airplane. And we met. He gave me a check for $1,700. And I signed it, of course. I had to sign it. And then I passed it over to my parents. And then, of course, he got the car and the key and the title and the paperwork. And he was happy as he could be to have his car. And I was thrilled. I was just as thrilled as I could be, because now I had the money that my parents could deposit in the bank, and then we could send a check to Newbold College, and I would be good for the year. Now, what do you think of that story? It's a true story. It happened just like that. And it just reinforced in me that if you're acting in faith, and if you're living by faith, you can depend on God to see you through. It was a great year. I never once was sorry about selling my idol in order to go over there. I had no reason No reason to be sorry for making that trade. But I still haven't reached the important part of the sermon. The important part of the sermon had to do with a man who taught several different courses at Newbold College. And his name was Dr. John Woodfield. Dr. Woodfield was the first man I met on registration day when I set foot on Newbold College campus for the first time, and then started into the registration process, going through all the lines, meeting all the people, signing all the papers. Dr. John Woodfield was my advisor. And he was just a great guy. He was a guy that I liked the first time I met him there in the registration line. The classes Dr. Woodfield taught were fine arts, English literature, and homiletics. Homiletics is, of course, the art of preaching. And, of course, that was one of the classes that I took. I also took fine arts from him, but I had no reason to take an English literature course. So I took fine arts from him, and I still remember the field trips that he would take the class on down into London. Newbold College is about 40 miles from the center of London. And he would load us all up on the bus or in cars, however it happened to be arranged, and we would make our way down in there to London, and he would show us the various buildings and the various architectural features that he would be teaching us about in the fine arts class. He taught us about flying buttresses and gargoyles and, the Ionic and the Doric and the Corinthian columns on the front of the big buildings. He taught about a lot of other things that I don't remember now, but I do remember those several types of columns from the class. And then he was also the teacher of the homiletics class. Now, I want to explain something to you. There's a major difference between education in the United States of America and education in the European countries. The major difference is that in America, we are taught a lot by memorization. You just have to memorize. And that's the way you learn the course material, and your tests are based on that memorization and how well you're able to do that. In England, the emphasis is on expression, being able to express yourself. And so from the time they're little kids, they're taught to write a good sentence, and then to write a clear paragraph, and then to make a whole outline with an introduction and a conclusion, and all the points as you make your way through. And so the people that I was sitting in the class with had all been educated in Europe. From the time they were 10 years old, they were writing sentences and paragraphs and writing outlines for their speech or their talk, and then delivering those things. And they were good at it. And I felt very inferior. And so we had this one particular assignment in the homiletics class there, and I made my outline for a sermon, and I submitted it, and I thought, I'm going to get a C for this. I actually felt like I'd be lucky to get a C. And to my surprise, when I got my paper back, Dr. Woodfield had given me an A. And I thought, what? How in the world how did this happen? How was it that he was able to sign me an A? And later on, I figured that he must have been using the power of suggestion. In other words, by giving me the A when I had submitted a C quality paper, I thought he was exercising the power of suggestion. In other words, he probably knew me well enough to know that if he gave me a grade I didn't deserve, I would work harder the next time. And he was right. Whether that was what he was thinking or not, he was right. I worked as hard as I've ever worked in my life for everything I submitted to Dr. Woodfield. and his class there in homiletics. I remember one time Dr. Woodfield liked to take the homiletics class on field trips too. So he got us together, and we drove down into the heart of London, and we visited the church of someone named John R.W. Stott. He was a well-known Anglican priest who had served as a missionary for his church. And he was probably, I'm trying to give you a comparison now, he was probably as well-known in England at the time as Billy Graham is known in the United States of America. That's who John R.W. Stott was. He was that well-known. And so we drove there down to his chapel one evening. It was an evening, and I think it was a weekday evening. It was like the midweek service that he was giving. And he preached about the three temptations of Christ in the wilderness. I still remember the subject. He preached, let me ask you to guess how long the sermon lasted. Anybody want to make a wild guess? How long do you think the sermon on the three temptations of Christ lasted? Good enough guess. It lasted for 10 minutes. But it was a sermon that covered all the main points that you would want to make on the three temptations of Christ. He said everything that needed to be said about the three temptations of Christ in 10 minutes, and he was done. And we were taken there and allowed to listen to this great preacher for a reason. And that is because Dr. Woodfield wanted us to be brief and to the point. And organized, of course. And he was very organized. Then we went back to college, and the year continued. Well, I'm just barely approaching the heart of the sermon today, at this point in the sermon, because it finally became John Woodfield's turn to preach to the students at Newbold College during one of the college chapels or assemblies. And I thought, okay, for the first time now I get to hear this man who's been teaching me how to preach, and I'll get to evaluate him. I'm not going to give him a grade that he would be interested in receiving, but I'm going to make a grade in my own mind as I preach to him. So on this particular chapel day, on the campus of Newbold College, Dr. Woodfield invited all of us students to open our Bibles to Genesis chapter 1. And what he did was he showed me something about the Sabbath that I had never seen before. And as I told you earlier, I considered it to be an example of preaching the Sabbath more fully. So this is how he did it. I'm reading now out of Genesis chapter 1, and it's a little hard for me to see the letters because I don't have my glasses. I wasn't prepared for this, you know. Rather than reading, maybe it would be a better idea for me just to rehearse for you the 7 days of creation as we find them in Genesis chapter 1. Maybe that would be a better way to do it. I think I could tell it better than read it to you. And I'll ask you to exercise your imaginations too, or your memory, I should say, as we go through the days. On day 1, God said, "Let there be" what? Light. And there was light. And the narrative in Genesis 1 goes on to tell us that before day 1 was finished, there was a dark part of the day too. So what God actually created on day 1 of creation was darkness and light, both things. And we know that it happened in a 24-hour period. As if we read the Bible and we take the account literally, the first day was 24 hours in length, and it consisted of light and darkness. Okay, that's day 1. Day 2, we see that what God did was he created an atmosphere above the earth, and we know now that it's what we breathe in and breathe out, the atmosphere consisting of the various gases and the way they're all combined together to make something we call air that we can breathe in and out of our lungs, and we can function as the beings that God made us. So on day 2, what God made was the air above the earth, and then some of the vapors that had been in the atmosphere fell down onto the earth and made what we call the seas, or the water on the surface of the earth. So on day 1, we have light and darkness. On day 2, we have the atmosphere and the ocean, what we would now call the ocean. And then we come to day 3. On day 3, what was it that God caused to appear on the earth? Dry land. That's right. I heard some of you say it. He caused the dry land to appear, and then the herbs of the field, the grasses, the trees, and the fruits that grew on those trees, all of that appeared, a perfect environment. But now we see what I had never seen before. We have the first 3 days, ending in the 3rd day, where dry land appeared and the perfect environment, but it was absent of any animal creation at this point. So what we have on day 4, exactly 3 days after day 1, were the bodies of light that worked to mark off the light and the darkness. So on day 1, you have the light and the darkness, and exactly 3 days later, you have the bodies of light, principally the sun and the moon. We know that the moon rules the night, and the sun rules the day. On day 5, we find that God creates now the birds that flew in the air or the atmosphere, and the fishes and all the sea creatures that lived in the ocean. Exactly 3 days after those environments had been created. And then on day 3, we remember the dry land appeared with all the trees and all the grass and all the beauty. And on day 6, then God began to create what? Animals and man. And so what we have in the creation week is not 7 days as much as it is 3 pairs of 2 days, making 6 days. And then we have a day that God creates, but it doesn't have any counterpart, right? It doesn't have a day that it's paired with. Can you see that? It's by itself. And so if we were to use our imagination now and create a visual for ourselves, what we have here is day 1 and day 4 on the bottom. Let's say this is ground level right here. We have day 1, day 4, then we have day 2 on top of that, and day 5, and then day 3 and day 6. Can you see that in your mind? And then as a capstone on the top of those 3 pairs of 2 days, you have what? You have the Sabbath, which shows that it doesn't have any counterpart, which means that it's special. It's something you can't substitute for. You can't just choose another one of the days of the week and say, that's a better day to be the Sabbath, because that's not the way it was in the original creation. You can see that this is foundational. And so Dr. Woodfield became an example of what he was trying to teach us in a homiletics class. What he tried to teach us in the homiletics class was to be organized and to be orderly and to work from the beginning consistently, logically through to the end, and then to make our appeal based on all the foregoing. And he was a perfect example of that. He had much more to say than I'm able to share with you today, but I'd like to read again the scripture that Leonard read for you earlier. I got to find it here. Now, why can't I find? Oh, there it is. Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3 says, "And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his works which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all the work which God had created and made." And so in Genesis 2 and 3, we're told that God rested. Now, is this because God was tired? No. God is omnipotent. We find this throughout the Bible, that there's no limit to the power of God. He's omnipotent. He's altogether powerful. And he doesn't get tired, no matter what he does. So his rest had to be something different from a nap. And we could take some clues from this about how we should keep the Sabbath. And then saying that, I'm preaching to myself as much as I'm preaching to any of you. But we don't want to spend the whole Sabbath afternoon napping, right? That wouldn't be a proper way to observe the Sabbath, because that's not what God did. What he did was he reflected upon all that he had done in the previous 6 days, those 3 pairs of 2 days. He reflected upon it, and he was satisfied with it because he called it very good. But one of the main points to make is that this blessing that God pronounced on the 7th day of the week, the 7th-day Sabbath, was before there was ever a Jew in the world. It took many thousands of years before there was ever a Jew, someone that we could call a Jew. And so what does this do to the argument that the Sabbath is given to the Jews? It nullifies it. It shows us there's just no foundation there, because the Sabbath was blessed at the very beginning of creation. And this is a very important point to make. Now, you've all heard about the assassination of Charlie Kirk. We're still hearing about it. It's still one of the biggest stories in the news. And we haven't seen the end of it yet. We're going to be hearing a lot more of it. And all of the outworkings of the story. But I was curious because I had heard that Charlie was a Sabbath keeper. And so I just simply got my telephone and Googled this question. And this is how I worded the question. This is important that you get exactly the way I worded it, because that way you won't make any other mistakes. I said, was Charlie Kirk a seventh-day Sabbath keeper? That was the question that I entered to Google. And I got the answer back, but I don't have it with me because I didn't know I'd be speaking to you today. But I can remember what it said. It says, yes, Charlie Kirk is a seventh-day Sabbath keeper. And then it goes on to say that he was first acquainted with the Sabbath by some pastor friend of his. A little bit later, it said that he learned about the Sabbath from a Jewish friend of his named Dennis Prager. But it doesn't matter how he learned about it. The fact is that when he learned about it, he did something about it. Amen? He kept it, in other words. As I was reminded last night as I attended the meetings in the Grants Pass Church with Dr. DeRose. Dr. DeRose. It's important, if we're going to understand the work of God in the world, not only to learn about it, but to keep it. And this is what made Charlie Kirk different from thousands of others out there. When he learned about the seventh-day Sabbath, he began to keep it. Google went on to tell me that what he did, he observed what he referred to as a tech-free Sabbath. By that, what he simply meant was he turns off his telephone and he turns off his computer. So he isolates himself, in other words, from the world that those two things give you access to. And in order to replace it with something and not just create a vacuum, what he does is he turns it into a day for family. So Charlie Kirk and his wife would spend more quality time with each other on the Sabbath day, and of course they would find something to do with their children. So that's the kind of Sabbath that Charlie Kirk was observing. And as you go on and read more about it, you find out from Google or from many other sources that it is sometimes referred to as a Jewish Sabbath in the Google materials. But we just took care of that little situation, didn't we? It's not a Jewish Sabbath. This is a Sabbath for all men. As it says in Mark or Matthew, the Sabbath was created for man and not man for the Sabbath. But that doesn't mean that we can keep the Sabbath in any way we choose. It doesn't mean that we should treat the Sabbath like we treat any other day of the week. In fact, one of the guidelines for Sabbath keeping is to try to make it as different as you can from the other days of the week, right? Those in Jewish literature, what you'll find is the first 6 days of the week are referred to as common days. They're the days that we are engaged in, and legitimately so, engaged in the common activities of life. We have to work if we want to get paid, right? If we want to be supported, then we dedicate ourselves to a job, and we work a certain amount of hours for the employer, and we're given a paycheck. And with that paycheck, we can pay for our rent, and we can pay for our groceries, and we can do, whatever else needs to be done with money. But that's common activity. So on the Sabbath day, we want to cease from work, right? We don't want to do what we can do on any of the other 6 days of the week. We want to do something different from that. And so we spend our time in the Scripture, Bible study and fellowship and community worship like we're doing here right now. We want to do things like that. So I thought I would finish my sermon today by looking at the commandment for Sabbath keeping, which was given to the Jews, by the way, but it was already blessed and sanctified before they got it from God. So we turn to Exodus 20. Verses 8 through 11, and I have a reason for taking you through this. I'm not just trying to fill up time. I want to show you something about it. Okay, so here it is, Exodus 20, verses 8 through 12. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your manservant, nor your son or your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days, and this is the reason given now, in Exodus, this is the reason given for Sabbath keeping. This last verse here. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. And then it goes on with the fifth commandment to honor your parents. So the reason is given in Exodus to keep the Sabbath is it's a memorial of creation. Amen. That's the reason that we keep it. And many have observed over the years that if mankind had only been faithful to the fourth commandment, we would have far fewer atheists or agnostics in the world, because we would be reminded of the great creation process and the orderly way in which God made the world. But I want you to notice there's another reason for keeping the Sabbath, and that's found in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, the Sabbath commandment is repeated along with the other 9, and yet there's a different reason given for keeping it in Deuteronomy. So I'm trying to find it here with my limited eyesight. Verse 12, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son nor your daughter, nor your male servant nor your female servant, this should sound familiar, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your cattle, nor the stranger that is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. Well, not many of us have male and female servants, but it still applies to us, right? If somebody's on our property or within our gates, then we want them to have the Sabbath blessing as well. But here's the reason given in Deuteronomy. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And I have now just one last reference before finishing today. And that is Isaiah chapter 58, verses 13 and 14. And the reason I include this is that I think most people who attend a Seventh-day Adventist church, whether they're members or not, but I believe that most people who attend a Sabbath-keeping church do pretty well not working on the Sabbath day. But I find that there's a little more of a problem when it comes to Isaiah 58. And so I'd like to include this as a reminder that if we're going to keep the Sabbath day the way that God intends for us to keep the Sabbath day, in other words, if we want the maximum blessing from the Sabbath day that is available there, we need to keep Isaiah 58 in mind as well. And here it is, verses 13 and 14. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your, is anybody reading along with me? Your own ways. not doing your own ways, not finding your own pleasure, not speaking your own words. Then you shall delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. And so I think that generally speaking, we as Sabbath-keeping Christians do real well not working on the Sabbath day, but we have a little more of a problem when it comes to speaking our own words and finding our own pleasures. I think that we could improve a great deal in those areas. And so I wanted to include that. Well, thank you for listening to me as I shared my story with you. I assure you it was a true story, and I didn't embellish it any. I told it to you exactly the way it happened. In the process of going to college at Newbold College in England for that year, my life was changed. And I want to give credit not only to God, but to a man named Dr. John Woodfield. The way that he loved me as a student and loved all the other students was clear. It was obvious. He was one of the most beloved teachers on the campus. And Dr. John Woodfield just died last year. And you don't know the exact numbers, so I'm just going to tell you. He was 108 years old when he died. So I thank God. I thank God for the experience that he gave me. It was an exciting time. It was an adventure. It was a time that I will always remember, and I'll share it as often as I can. Let's sing our closing hymn. I believe that it's chosen for you in the bulletin. We'll sing that hymn together, and then we'll have our benediction.